Good evening and welcome. It's a remarkable thing to be on a community. We're north of 600 on this call at this moment. And it's really a momentous kind of time for our community and for Harvard. And the concern and the sense of possibility and urgency on campus and in the world is great. And it's precisely to draw us together and to build a uh, informed, cohesive, and effective alumni community that this call is here, and it's so important that each of you is here. My name is Jason Rubenstein. I'm an alumnus of the college, 2004, and the executive director of Harvard Hillel. I'm joining this call, which is a joint project with the 1636 Forum with my colleague Allison Wu there. 1636 is a group of over 20,000 concerned alumni who are working to rededicate Harvard to its missions, pursuit of truth, and academic excellence. And our presenters on the call tonight are Professor Jared Elias of Harvard Law School, one of the co-chairs of the Anti-Semitism Task Force and co-authors of its recent EPIC report. Professor David Shizer, a former dean of Columbia Law School, one of the co-chairs of its anti-Semitism task force, and someone who can uniquely speak to the work of implementation of a project of this type, which is the work that we are turning to as a community. And Rabbi David Wolpe, who will be joining once we've got the technical details of the links straightened out. Rabbi Wolpe, as Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Sinai in Los Angeles, internationally recognized teacher and scholar, and was in residency at Harvard Divinity School for last year, where he kind of experienced firsthand and has developed a really trenchant analysis of the university, which he's continued to share to this day. In this call, over the next 55 minutes or so, we'll hear from each of the presenters about kind of their specific area of expertise and concern as it relates to this. Professor Elias will give a broad overview, really kind of drawing to some specifics. Sorry, before that, Allison will give us a really detailed and parsimonious summary of the reports that have come out, so you know. Then Professor Elias will draw some specific themes and images out that maybe one would miss on a first read, but are particularly kind of stick and animate us. Rabbi Wolpe will speak about what it would take to maybe not just play defense, but offense and build a Jewish life, a Jewish thought at Harvard that is leading for the Jewish community. And then Professor Shiza will speak about really the work of implementation, what they've learned at Columbia, and lessons that we can maybe save ourselves from having to learn the hard way. We will be taking questions from you all in the chat, which we will then pose to the presenters afterwards. And we'll wrap up at 9:30 with a set of steps that each person in this community can take to help move this work forward together. So with that, Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us what's in these 500 pages of reports.
Sure. Thanks, Jason, for having me here. I think there are plenty of people on this call who are subscribers to the 1636 Forum newsletter, so read our recap and analysis that we sent out less than 24 hours after the report came out. But I'll recap now, basically, the anti-Semitism report. I'll touch briefly on the Islamophobia report, and I'll mention the actions that President Garber announced alongside the release of these reports. So I think the most important thing that came out of the anti-Semitism report um, is that shunning and intolerance of different viewpoints has been one of the worst issues on campus. And President Garber said in a Boston Globe interview recently that this is where a lot of his focus is. So the anti-Semitism report shows that students basically end up getting excluded not just for their views, but who they are, especially if they're Israeli or perceived as Zionist. And I think a particularly helpful story to illustrate this was that the report recounted a time when Israeli students said that their classmates basically turned around and walked away if they learned that they were from Israel. Or in another example, there was a student with what was described as pro-Palestinian politics who refused to work with an Israeli classmate, but said that they had no real objection to the student's personality or critique of their academic work. And then the instructor approved this partner change request, saying that a student who supported the cause of an oppressed group should not be forced to work with a student identified as a member of an oppressor group. And I think that these dynamics are really at the forefront of the report, which is important to recognize because a lot of media attention has been focused on the Yard encampment last spring and what happened around discipline and inconsistent enforcement of rules. But there's also things that cannot exactly be addressed by rules. You can't make rules that people must be friends, for example, with Jewish or Israeli classmates. Some of the other key findings of the anti-Semitism report are that 73% of Jewish respondents to a survey that the task force put out said that they feel uncomfortable expressing their political opinions. So this is a really big change from even in 2019 when Harvard did its last Pulse survey on belonging. There's been this chilling effect on speech and identity, and it's really changed Jewish life on campus based on what the report found. There's been a breakdown in trust in double standards in how people view the response of Harvard's administration to what has happened on campus. And in the classroom, there's also been highlighted in this report a lack of rigorous and balanced course offerings about the Middle East, and it drives further ideological polarization. The recommendations of the anti-Semitism report basically fall into two categories. One is around improving campus culture and student experience, and that starts from the beginning. So the report recommends changes, for example, to admissions and orientation to promote a pluralistic culture and one of constructive dialogue from the start. It also recommends many other changes to things like the complaint and discipline systems. And then there's a second category it recommends changes around, which is governance. So these include things like that all academic programs at the university should meet high standards of academic excellence and be overseen by qualified faculty. And that programs need to align with university rules and values. And an example of this that's already happened is recently FAS Dean Hopi Hoekstra said that the directors of each of the FAS centers on campus would have to meet with divisional deans and show how their centers are actually aligned to the FAS and universities' guidelines on intellectual vitality. Quickly, I just want to touch on the Islamophobia report. So the Islamophobia report was put together in a similar way. So there were nearly 50 listening sessions across campus, and there was a joint task force survey. It found that nearly half of Muslim students reported feeling physically unsafe. And often what was cited for this was what are known as the doxing trucks displaying student faces of students who perhaps were part of student groups who signed the letter on October 7th or were involved in other things on campus or perceived to be. They also, the people who contributed at these listening sessions also said that they were similarly very dissatisfied with the institutional response from Harvard. They felt, for example, that President Claudine Gay had been very dismissive of their concerns, though they felt more positively toward Alan Garber, for example. And then there's students and faculty, when speaking to the members of the Islamophobia task force, reported basically that they felt a climate of fear and self-censorship around speaking about issues related to Palestine. And in particular, the report highlights that students felt extra on edge after Harvard, as part of the Brandeis Center settlement in January, adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. In response to these findings, the Islamophobia task force recommends several changes. And so the categories are basically institutional transparency and student support. So these are things like expand tailored support for mental health, dedicated to professionals who understand the mental health needs of students from these backgrounds, offering more resources for doxing, clarifying policies around protest, and then changes to academic freedom and free expression, such as creating potentially free speech zones in Harvard Yard. And then importantly, both reports together, or each separately, recommend that Harvard embrace more of a culture of pluralism and perhaps actually create an official center for pluralism as the way that the university looks to address issues around diversity and belonging. I think I want to highlight just three other things that came up when reading both of these reports, which I am not doing these reports justice. Jared, you guys wrote a great report, and everyone should read all 300 plus pages if they get the chance. But the reports really show that Harvard set an unrealistic expectation for a lot of students over the years by selectively picking causes that it would make decisions, such as divestment from the endowment on. And so there's many examples of this. So there were changes to the endowment around tobacco, for example, and fossil fuels. And so it made sense in some ways that students felt that activism on campus could lead similarly to divestment from Israel. Another thing that came up was there's a rise of a safetyist mindset that's really changed how students view the purpose of the university. And a lot of that is that students view things as threatening to their safety today that years ago they might not have. One example is that in the Islamophobia report, students say that they felt physically unsafe because they know that Harvard endowment has not divested from Israel. That's really a change from even a decade ago in how students in higher education talk about the concept of safety. And then the third one I want to say, because I think it's important and it's optimistic, is that things were not always this way. As recently as 2017, the Anti-Semitism report says, you know, the Harvard Undergraduate Palestinian Solidarity Committee, which for those of you who haven't been as close to this is sometimes considered Harvard's equivalent of Students for Justice in Palestine, would sometimes attend dinners with the students who counter-protested against their protests. And today that's very different in that students involved in many of these groups will not speak to any of the students who disagree with them or who identify or are perceived to be Zionists, for example. And so I think that that should give us, it's heartbreaking in some ways, but it should also give us some hope that Harvard can very quickly change because that is not so long ago that this happened.
Tremendous. Thank you for that, Allison. I just want to second and third that recommendation to read the reports. It's actually an book length of original research that was produced in a year at no small expense of effort and from Jared and many others. So, Jared, if you would share with us, kind of reflecting on this, thinking of the now 737 people in the audience here, what would you want them to take away from this report, like looking back, and then as we begin to kind of look forward with this as a blueprint, not just a diagnosis?
Okay, well, so thank you, Jason, for the chance to talk today. And thank you to everybody for all of the interest you're showing in the topic. I wouldn't be a professor if I didn't suggest that you should all go and download the report and read it. That's always better than hearing a quick summary, as great as the quick summary was. But just I think what you see in the report, in some ways, I regret it being an anti-Semitism task force. I would have liked it in some ways to have been a student life task force, because what comes out in the report is the portrait of a university that's in transition, right? Sort of reconstituting itself after the pandemic. And the question is, what is life going to look like? And there are different people that have different views. The task force itself was amazing. It was such a privilege to work with the people on the task force. None of them are here today, as far as I can tell, but it was just an incredible group. And something that I think is an important point is that we were Harvard researchers, students and faculty, mostly faculty, but we had some wonderful student members as well. And we were working with Harvard data. So we wrote a report about Harvard, right? Because we had the chance to talk to students at Harvard, faculty at Harvard, staff at Harvard, and to learn about Harvard. But I don't think that the problems we identify and discuss are unique to Harvard. I think these are problems in American higher education. So we wrote, one of the goals that we had, my co-author Derek Penslar is an extraordinary historian of the Jewish community and, Israel. And we wrote a history section with Shai Jerome, who's a lecturer in the sociology department, was the primary author, where we go decade by decade in the hopes that all of you could find yourselves and then follow the chronology forward and see how things changed, right? And see how the world today is different from the worlds that you remember in the Harvard of the 1980s or the 1990s or the 2000s. And then the second thing we did is we wanted to document in great detail a political project that we found at work in different ways across different parts of the university, that aims to accomplish essentially, the delegitimization in some ways of the state of Israel, or viewed more charitably from their perspective, working to correct what they see as a profound injustice, which is American support for Israel, or in some cases even more extreme, like the establishment of the state of Israel. You see this throughout the university. We document it, but I don't think that this is a Harvard problem. I think this really is a problem that you see in different parts, in different places throughout higher education. In some ways, there are partisan think tanks that exist at universities. A couple of things that we learned that really surprised me when I started this effort. I never would have expected the extent to which Israeli students and staff and faculty as well are often treated by peers in a way that's just shameful. To be more specific, like a story that stuck with us. As we met a young Harvard student who was a graduate student at one of the schools, who was being bullied. And then other students who are friends with this Israeli student were being bullied for being friends with them, right? Non-Jewish students were being bullied for being friends with this Israeli student, these non-Jewish students, and we spoke with them. So like we feel very confident in the integrity of the story. Um, they didn't know anything about the Middle East. They didn't know anything about Israel. They just know that there was like a nice person who they met in class. And that's probably the Harvard you remember. You don't remember a Harvard where people would want to be cruel to one another on the basis of their national identity. And it was very surprising to me to encounter that this was something that happened. As Allison mentioned, like things used to be different here. People used to be much more interested in connecting in their good fortune as being Harvard students and Harvard affiliates. And something there has changed a little bit, right? There was a quote that I put in the report that I'm sure some people would have preferred that I didn't, but I think is important, which is a Harvard graduate student who had been a Harvard college student in the 2010s said, that Jewish students at Harvard are now being treated like we used to treat Republicans. And I'm paraphrasing, I give the actual quote in the report, but there's something to the idea that there's an intolerance among some students of other students who have ideas that they don't agree with. And you see that. And I was surprised. That wasn't what I would have expected to see. In many cases, you would have a small number of, people who were really not nice, who would then stir up others. But it was a phenomenon that I didn't expect to be present. The history section reveals that Jews have always faced challenges at the same time that they thrived on the Harvard campus. Those challenges have been different across different eras. But they've always been there. It's just a question of where they were. And that's just, I think, a part of Jewish history that never really stopped. The good news is that the vision of the university that I think we all share, a place of learning and excellence where pluralistic excellence is what brings us together, where we're interested in inquiry and in having hard conversations about controversial topics. I think that version of Harvard is in fact Harvard at its best. So to the extent we advocate for changes at Harvard that are good for the Jewish community or good for Israeli students, we have Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab students on our campus who all face barriers. We're urging Harvard to make changes that will lead to a better Harvard. And with that, I encourage you to read the report. There's a lot there, but just remember, this is not really a story about a single university. That's kind of like a case study, right? This is really about this profound change in the culture of American higher education. And I do think that the current administration cares a lot, understands the problems, and is working hard to make this a place where Jewish students, staff, and faculty can thrive even more than they currently are and even more than they have in the past. So I do think there really is an institutional commitment to healthy reform at the moment. And I think that a lot of people, when I look across my email box, which has been flooded since the release of the report, the dominant response among, colleagues on the faculty or others is surprise. They had no idea. And I hope that the report helps them to see a world that those of us who work more closely with students, and I don't include myself in that. I mean, I'm a tenured professor. I usually avoid students. That was a joke. I think it's something that those people who work more closely with students knew, and I hope that this report helps to give voice to those students so their stories can connect with others who then understand what's going on.
Great. Thank you for that,
Oh,
James. So
yeah.
much more. Oh,
I just got an important message from Allison. When I say the administration, I'm talking about the Harvard administration. What's going on in the government, I really don't know anything about. I mean, I know a little bit, but at Harvard, we are so pompous that we refer to the administration as the Harvard administration because Alan Garber is our president.
it's a bumper sticker. somewhere in there. In terms of the work of the administration, I do want to actually just pivot back to Allison for a second, just to catch people up on the changes that have been kind of made recently and that have been announced, because it's a lot to keep track of, and there are some very significant ones.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to say this earlier. So, alongside releasing both reports, President Garber announced several initiatives at Harvard, and I'll just go through a few of them and mention a few things he's done in the past as well. But our newsletter might be one of the best ways, or Hillel's newsletter, one of the best ways to keep track of ongoing updates of things that the school has been doing over the last year and a half and moving forward. So the most important thing he announced is that he's asking each school within Harvard to present action plans for at the school level what they'll do to address these things by the end of this semester. Not that they'll take those actions, but submit those. And that's really important because Harvard's a highly decentralized place, and the office of the president can only do so much. The deans govern each of their schools, so it's really critical and smart of him to ask for that. He also announced that the admissions processes at each school will be reevaluated, or at least at some schools will be reevaluated. So they'll try to give a boost to students who demonstrate the ability to engage in constructive dialogue across difference. And this speaks again to the theme of pluralism. There will also be updates to pre-orientation and orientation programs for students in this fall semester, particularly at the college, but other places in the university as well. And those changes will be focused on how to promote principles of inclusion, openness, and fairness. He announced a research project on anti-Semitism, which will be led by a faculty expert in the field. It was not announced who, as well as an initiative to study the history of Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians at Harvard. And then he alluded to several times accelerated efforts to try to create a major initiative to promote viewpoint diversity at Harvard, but didn't offer too many details beyond that in his announcement. A few other things have happened in the last week or so that are important to note as well. Last week, President Garber announced that he was centralizing cross-school disciplinary procedures under the office of the president. And that was one of the key reasons why discipline was not properly enforced on the Yard encampment last year, or in response to some other violations of time, place, and manner rules last year. The other thing that was announced this week by the chief diversity officer at Harvard is that the university's Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging will be renamed to the Office of Community and Campus Life. And that philosophically, the office is going to shift away from its existing framework and towards one that will focus on the unique experiences of each individual rather than the broad demographic groups that they belong to. One other thing that happened this week that's important was that Harvard released its 2024 campus-wide pulse survey, which is a survey Harvard does across the university looking at students' sense of belonging. And it found that 47.5% of Jewish students feel comfortable expressing their opinions to others at Harvard, which is a significant decline from about 70% in 2019, which was the last time that the survey was released. There have been other actions that Harvard and President Garber have taken on some of these issues across the last year or so, but those are just the ones I want to touch upon quickly right now.
Great, thank you. And we can go into more of this in the Q&A. Rabbi Wolpe, I want to frame the question really for you, which is, you're an expert, one of the world's experts in Judaism, and we speak a lot about Jewish students and students' experience and, kind of free exchange of ideas as we should. And I think at the same time, all of us on this call feel that there's something that's important about the image of Judaism at Harvard, the way it's portrayed, the way it's been, I think, kind of besmirched often, and also the possibility of there being something very different, not just undoing those libels or ending those libels, but actually then like a really productive engagement with Harvard that produces something Jewish, which I imagine is what brought you to the divinity school in the first place. So if you could just kind of reflect now, like on your experience and what we might hope for, should we hope for, and how we could get there.
Just that? Is that
Just
it? Just that.
I do want to add one other thing, which is so critical about a perspective that you have that almost no one else has. There's the world off campus, and there's of us who live on campus, and there's so few people who cross.
They're very. There's so much to say, but let me start by just saying to Jared that the report was very impressive, and I have quibbles like everyone would have quibbles. I actually read all 311 pages, but it was clear that these were serious people doing serious work, and we ought to be very grateful for that. And so thank you. And the second part of this was that I have a lot of problems with the reports being released in tandem. I just want to say that. I'm not going to go into all the reasons why I believe that's so. I won't even tell you that according to the FBI hate statistics, the FBI's own statistics, 68% of all religious hate crimes were against Jews, 8.7% were against Muslims. And I think that that statistic will stand on its own for the magnitude of the problem that we were dealing with at Harvard as well, which I don't think was equivalent. But now I will restrict myself just to the Jewish side, having offended at least a third of the audience. What I would say is that I was at the Divinity School, and Divinity School was kind of the perfect storm of, it has remnants of classical Christian anti-Semitism, which is just part of the legacy of thousands of years, as well as it is among the most, if not the most, hard left progressive faculty and students, which have their own hostility, certainly to Israel and derivatively to Jews, and also of Islamic studies, which, depending on the variety, can also be hostile to Jews. And again, after October 7th, I think became more so for reasons that everybody can understand. And so there was, however, very little sort of just classical Jewish study. The first event that I went to before October 7th was a Sukkot event, where the opening of the Sukkot event was a student who said, this is a safe space for anti-Zionists, non-Zionists, and those who are struggling with their Zionism. And I thought, okay, so not for me, obviously, because I'm not any of those things, but that already tells you what the atmosphere was at the Divinity School, and I think that's generalizable. So the first thing I would say is that, and this is a really difficult problem, that the staff and faculty, and I think that therefore the students, have to accept the fact that normative Judaism is an acceptable form of Judaism, because that was not the message that most of the Jewish students that I taught got at Harvard. Normative Judaism was the kind that was anathematized. The fact that the vast majority of Jews are Zionists was not something that people were willing to accept. And I think that that's not a problem that you can legislate. And so I have a lot of sympathy for an administration that is dealing with a culture that is unsympathetic to some of the goals that they want to achieve. And the question is, can there be an ideological shift in the faculty and staff? And I'm not sure that that is as achievable as we would hope. But having said that, at least the recognition that the lack of acceptance of normative Judaism is a problem is the beginning of groping towards a solution. So yes, I think you need more figures from the Jewish world who are not far left-wing academics, however learned they may be or nice they may be, but who are kind of mainstream Jewish figures. And those were not thick on the ground at Harvard, even in Jewish studies or studies akin to Jewish studies. And when you brought people like that, and I was not the only one, but I'll use myself as an example, there was literally no invitation ever, except one from the Kennedy School to speak about, which was about Israel and anti-Semitism, to speak about Judaism. I mean, I was at the Divinity School. I was never asked, except once before October 7th, to speak about forgiveness with a Christian pastor, never asked to speak about Judaism, never asked to speak about Israel, never asked to speak about anti-Semitism, never reached out to by any faculty member after October 7th. So there's a lot of work to do. And I think that the anti-Semitism report makes that clear. And I think it's also what Jared said is exactly right. This is not because Harvard is this enclave of antipathy to, I think it is a societal problem that manifests itself at many elite universities, of which Harvard is just one paradigmatic example. But I think a commitment to, we need to learn what not specifically academic critics of the religion have to say, but what the religion itself has to say and representatives of the religion itself has to say, would be a really good place to start. And I suspect that there may be other traditions that would feel the same way, but certainly that's true of Judaism.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Wolpe. I want to share just a walk down memory lane for personal.
I'm asking, people are asking what normative Judaism is.
Oh,
Normative
fair.
Judaism is a Judaism that believes in God, Torah, and Israel. That is, whatever variety of God, Torah, Israel you take, it is a faith that feels a solidarity with the Jewish people, a commitment to the Jewish people living in their land, to mitzvot, that is, to Jewish practice, believes in the idea of Klal Yisrael, that the Jewish people have an obligation to one another in a familial sense. And also, it is, after all, the first of the three great theistic faiths. And so God, Torah, Israel is an easy way of giving a quick answer to that question.
Beautiful. I wanted to give one compare and contrast, as as Professor Elias was saying, how it used to be different. So I graduated the college in 2004. The most popular class was Professor Michael Sandel's Justice, where students kind of engaged in argumentation. Felt like the whole campus took it every fall. And the second most popular class was James Kugel's The Bible, every spring, that had about 700 students. And one of the things Kugel wanted his students to understand is this was not just a book. It was something that was being lived by thousands of their Harvard colleagues. And so every year when they got to the section on Psalms, one of the TFs would send out an email on the Hillel list. And junior year, I took them up on this. I think I got paid $5 to go up to the front of the class and kind of chant a psalm the way the Jewish people do in a time of distress.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that a lot, because if you had said something like, the relationship of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was invented in the 19th century as part of British imperialism, after the Balfour Declaration, you would have been laughed out of the room by the 2,500 students who were either taking or had taken that class. They said, but I just read the story about Jeremiah being jailed in Jerusalem.
So there's
the role of the number of Jewish kids, but there's also the role of religion. And I'll just point out, also the number of mainline Protestants at Harvard has plummeted. It's about 5% as well. And so part of what we're actually seeing in this kind of the rise of a hard left, epistemology way of seeing the world has to do with a decline of not just of American religion, but much more rapidly of the place of religion and even just a literacy in the Bible among Harvard students.
That is certainly true. And also what you point to is there is a deep anti-Western bias. And my armchair analysis of this is as follows. People confuse disillusion with truth, by which I mean, for a long time, the Western story was told paying lip service to the terrible things that Western civilization has done, but not really educating people in it. And when a generation came along in which people really took a full reckoning of some of the damage that Western civilization has done, they saw that as all that Western civilization is. And so in the name of the values that Western civilization brought to them, they protest the existence of it. But a strong, pluralistic, freedom-loving, individualistic Western culture that is curious about other cultures, that is a very powerful, that's the model that created Harvard in the first place. And I think that there is a hostility to that again, derivatively becomes a hostility to the Jewish people.
I want to point out we're really at a transitional moment now, and we're going to transition over to you, Professor Shizer. And what I mean by that is, I think the most accurate narrative of kind of how we've come to this moment slowly, right? It's 19 months since October 7, is that pretty early on, the central administration of the university, the Harvard administration, realized that there were deep problems to be addressed that had burst into full view, and that to address them would take finding a way for professors to realize things were worse than they realized. And the report was the vehicle to do that and has provided the foundation. Now we've just laid the foundation for the work, and there's now a pivot of our time perspective forward. You know, we kind of look back, count the months since October 7, but what comes next? You know, how do you have this report not just be a document on a shelf, but a roadmap for a set of changes, a revitalization of the university in certain ways. And so for that, we have one of the very few people in the world who can speak to this question, having themselves authored one of these reports and worked diligently and facing not a few difficulties. Professor David Shizer, it was, we're proud to carry as an alumnus also. So if you could tell us, what have you learned in the work of this implementation? I know there's been a lot of noise, and more than noise coming from Washington, but just internally in Columbia, what has the path forward been like for you? And what would you kind of counsel us as a community now as we take the recommendations, hopefully from paper into reality?
Jason, thanks for including me. I want to be very clear with everyone that I am a guest. I am an outsider. Don't expect any insight from me about the details of what's happening at Harvard. You have wonderful experts with me here who have covered that. Jason, as you said, I'm really here to talk about the dynamics of task forces and this question of implementation. So I will quickly share 6 observations about them. The first, Jason, follows immediately from what you were saying. Implementation is going to be critical. There are 2 ways to think about a task force. A critical way is to say, this is a fig leaf. This is something universities and other institutions might do in order to create the illusion of doing something, but actually not doing anything at all. I'm happy to say that I'm quite confident that's not the case at Harvard. It hasn't been the case at Columbia. But the question is, how do you avoid just being, Jason, as you said, a book on the shelf? How do you actually make this report, this wonderful report, an engine of change? The second thing I want to observe is, I hope you know, it's not actually the task force's job. And at least at Columbia, there has often been a bit of a misunderstanding about what the role of an anti-Semitism task force is. Some members of our community, and perhaps of the Harvard community as well, think of it as a crisis response team. I have a friend who jokes about flying in with a cape and dealing with a situation, and it's simply not what task forces are meant to do. They also don't adjudicate anything. They don't have management authority. The management authority rests with others. Task forces are supposed to study a problem thoughtfully and carefully and to write recommendations. The third point that I want to make is to emphasize how important that can be, and therefore what a contribution I think this Harvard report is. I think it's fantastic. I think it's been a really, really important contribution to the Harvard community. And the first point is something Jared mentioned. I had the same experience. A lot of members of the faculty simply don't know what the student experience has been. And they often think in terms of the student experience they had and of what they personally observe. And so it can come as quite a shock when they start reading and they realize what students have been going through. So the ability to inform the community about a problem that needs to be addressed is critical. But the other thing that a task force does is the members dig in and really try to understand the problem. And part of the reason why a task force can do this is it's composed of insiders, people who really understand the institution. And certainly when you read the report of the Harvard Task Force, you can see how clearly deeply the task force understands to fix. So that brings me to the fourth issue, is making recommendations. It can be important, but ultimately the question is, will the recommendations be followed? Because in a sense, that's the billion-dollar question here. And I'll make an observation that I hope is obvious. It's really going to turn on two factors. The first is, who are the people who actually are going to implement specific recommendations? Who are they? And second, how aligned are they with the recommendations? Because if you make a recommendation to people who have been involved in formulating the recommendation and are already on board, that's a very good thing, something that we had the ability to do when before our reports were published. Some of our recommendations were already being implemented. My sense is that that's true at our as well. But I want to emphasize that specific recommendations will be the responsibility of different people within a large and intricate organization like Columbia, my home, or like Harvard. And so just looking at the recommendations in the Harvard report for a moment, there are a number that have to do with admissions. And there you could imagine senior leadership at the university, Harvard Corporation, having a conversation saying it would be really good to focus more on recruiting bridge builders than we have in the past. But the mere fact of that conversation won't really accomplish anything, because it's the deans of individual schools who supervise admissions. And of course, they're deans of admissions who supervise it in detail. And then you've got frontline admissions officers who read files, or in some cases, faculty who read files. I know this is something Jared does, among others. Now, my understanding is Harvard College has already been moving in the direction that the task force urged. There's a new question added to applications. I think that's impressive progress. But again, that's one team of people focused on one set of recommendations. The report also talks about the classroom. And for that, obviously, faculty buy-in is going to be particularly important. Many people who teach in Harvard classrooms have tenure. The goal of a report like this is to educate them about issues and to persuade them about what's needed in the classroom. I certainly think the report is very compelling there, but again, it's another audience. Still, one other audience to emphasize: there's compelling discussion about co-curricular activities. Allison also mentioned before, a key problem is social exclusion. It's true at Columbia as well. Well, there, part of the audience is other students, and that's just a different audience environment. So as we think about what is likely to happen, the predictions need to really be granular about who's going to be involved in either implementing or following these recommendations. Two more quick points then. There's a way in which Jared and his colleagues have finished their work, but not necessarily, because another function of a task force can be to play a role in implementation. There could be a checklist. There could be periodic meetings. And again, I don't know whether that's something Jared and his colleagues want to do. It is something that we at Columbia have been doing. And my last point is, monitoring implementation should by no means be the responsibility only of members of the task force. It should be the responsibility of all members of the Harvard community, including the hundreds of people who've joined this call. And the fact that you did suggests very strongly that you care about this issue, as of course you should. And so you also have a role to play. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for, I mean, the specificity, the granularity is exactly, I think we have to start to wrap our minds around, and that's exactly where we're headed, is a perfect charge. So we have, by my count, 66 questions in the Q&A. I've managed to kind of address a couple, but the scale of it is much larger than we'll be able to do in the remaining 11 minutes of our time here. And that's kind of the point. I do want to say that this is, it's hard to imagine this. We are early on. We're in the second inning of this story. This will not be the last time you'll hear from us. This is not the last time we're going to hear from you all. So we can address one of those 66 now. The others, I already see there's a couple emails in my inbox from people on this. Alice and I will discuss in a couple minutes how to stay in touch. But Jared, I did want to send a specific question from my friend and neighbor, Ira Stoll, your way. She says, well, there is the kind of an accurate and important kind of frame that this is there are broader trends in higher education, of which Harvard is merely an exemplar, and not just higher education, kind of literary circles, artistic, music, etc., is a similar kind of stigmatization of Israel that is fashionable and perhaps enforced. And yet, there are important differences. Brown's Jewish population seems much larger. Ira made the excellent point. One of the stories in the most troubling things that your report finds is that people who are admitted for residencies or even medical school or postdoctoral programs at Harvard, Jewish students and scholars have chosen other schools because of the attitude they've either found or heard about at Harvard. Those other schools seem to be better to them. So what can we do? There are these very broad factors which are kind of historical and scale, but there are clearly things that individual institutions can do, not just at the margins, but to make a meaningful difference and to separate themselves out from that stream. And if you could kind of point to, over the next year or two, what are a couple things that would you have some trust or hope in making a substantial difference, what would those be?
Sorry. So first, I don't know that I can give an answer here that will satisfy Ira, just because and it's always great to hear from you, Ira. But I haven't studied those other schools in order to have a good sense of like what are the things they've done differently. The two schools that I know best are Harvard and, of course, my alma mater, Columbia Law School, where David Chiser was a professor of mine in a tax class. And there, the problems are very similar. I also was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, and the problems there, I think, are really very similar. So as far as what exceptions there might be out there, I'm not sure that I know enough to be able to speak authoritatively to what those exceptions might be and why they might be. I'm just not sure. I think that's an important research topic that would be very valuable for future people working in this space. And I know there's interest now in building an academic field of the study of anti-Semitism, which really hasn't existed in a while in a way that perhaps it could, including at Harvard, where we're going to start a research project dedicated to it. I think you've identified really important questions. And so I know that didn't make you happy, but I think that's the best answer I can give. In terms of what's going to be effective, well, the first thing is, Harvard, because of the prominence and the sort of the prominence of the university and the public interest in what goes on here, it attracts a lot of attention, which means that our problems get disproportionate attention. It seems like in some ways there was a media story over the past 2 years where there was a split screen between like the Middle East and Harvard Yard. And that was probably not a good way to tell the story that really didn't reflect on what was happening. Or, David, I didn't mean to disrespect you, also Morningside Heights. That's obviously like just a fact of life that we have to deal with, but it probably does attract a little bit more in the way of people who come here in the hopes of doing political things, either as students or staff as faculty even, than a school like Stanford, which is further afield and on the West Coast and doing engineering-y stuff. In terms of what's going to make change, a focus on culture building, I think, is so important. I do think this year has been a better year than last year in a lot of ways. We have a new Hillel director. That's always an exciting thing. But I do think that this year there's been a recognition among our whole community that we need to do a better job of connecting with one another. Now, that's not to say that things are perfect. We're aware of very troubling incidents that have happened at this university this year. But I do think that we are starting to make some strides towards, building a culture where students are more excited to share their common civic identity as Harvard students than they are to want to yell at each other in social media, which is a challenge for the university. A second thing that I think really does matter is we do now have leadership across the university. If you look at some of the places that we describe real problems, and real challenges, well, those schools have new deans. And I believe that those new deans are working hard to address the specific concerns that we've identified, as well as creating space for the sort of constructive conversations and dialogue and Harvard level education that I think we all agree is an important value. And then finally, and I think Rabbi Wolpe talked about this. Jason also mentioned this. There is a lot of value in hopefully finding some people who want to come and teach, Judaism, like normative Judaism, as Rabbi Wolpe said, and Jewish history. Here, we have some wonderful teachers already, like Rabbi Wolpe identified challenges at the Divinity School. We certainly heard of those on the task force. We also had a member of the task force who's a wonderful historian of Second Temple Judaism. So there really is like some great things happening here. And it'd be good if we got more, and it would be especially good if we got like, the Bible taught as a gen ed class by a popular person again, because as Rabbi Rubenstein, pointed out, we don't have the same level. We don't know this, but my guess would be this was taken out of the report because we don't know it for a fact. But my guess is that we probably don't have the same level of religious literacy up and down the university that we had 20 years ago. 20 years ago, probably many more students came with knowledge of the Jews as opposed, and many more of them also were Jewish, but much more knowledge of the Jews. So the world has changed, and I'm hoping that some of what will come out of the work that we did is a renewed emphasis. There are a number of open chairs in Jewish studies as we have retirements over the past couple years, and I think we'll recruit some wonderful people to fill those chairs. We have an offer out right now for somebody who's great, and hopefully we continue to sort of reinforce for the students that this is a great topic and something they should be excited about learning more about, hopefully with an open mind.
Beautiful. It's really hard to stop anywhere. It's because it's like we could and in some sense need to go on for hours here, and also the hour is late, especially for us East Coasters. So we're gonna draw this installment to a close, with three kinds of takeaways for everyone here. And this recording will live in perpetuity, and Alice and I are going to tag team on these. The first is communicate with your schools. Or your alum, they have alumni affairs, they have communication staff. Those people want to hear from you, and more importantly, it's their job to hear from you, and both to answer and to keep note of the topics that you're raising. And Allison has like a particularly surprising and illustrative story here. Would you share that?
Yeah, so soon after October 7th, I was at an event that Harvard put on with a dean of one of the schools. And this was before I was really involved in any of this work. And interestingly, there was a member of the comm staff there who said something to me. He said, we've been basically on a road show. No one in any of the Q&A sessions has asked about anti-Semitism and some of these related questions. And so because we kind of use these Q&As as mini focus groups, we didn't realize the extent to which until they were at my session where people did ask, this was top of mind. Now, I think we can critique that as a form of market research all we want, but like given that's where the school is at, show up to those events. We feature a lot of them in our newsletter. You get them from the HAA newsletter. There's a lot of these events. Go and ask the questions. Keep it top of mind.
Amazing. The second thing is to give in targeted ways. This is not a moment to step back from the university. There are great people doing great work. And you also might have questions about, well, what's going to happen with the gift I give? And so there are some specific places where there will be an outsized and positive impact. And Allison, if you could kind of guide us through a few of what those are.
Yeah, I mean, we at 1636 Forum, we think that the smartest thing to do is to give intelligently to things that improve the climate on campus and don't make it worse. We have some recommendations on our website. If you email us, which lots of alumni do, we are happy to help give even more tailored ones to your interests, the school you went to, et cetera. There's obviously, I mean, Hillel is hosting this webinar, and so I would be remiss if I didn't say Hillel is a great place to give. There's a lot of other places you can give across the school. There's great work being done out of the Intellectual Vitality Initiative at Harvard College, where students are doing dialogue events across differences, for example. And I'm happy to say more about that. I also want to say, like, if you don't want to give for various reasons, it's important to be clear with the school about why you're not giving. Tell them that you want to see not just effort, but real results on these things, and make sure that they're hearing that regularly. It's so easy to forget about the dollars that go away, for example. And it's really important to keep that top of mind.
Great. And the last thing is to get and stay informed. It's something that we have learned in a way that, in retrospect, is maybe clearer. Is it at first, it looks like the kind of Byzantine, opaque nature of the bureaucracy at Harvard makes it hard to do things, and that is true to a certain degree. But much more significant than that is the Byzantine, opaque nature of the Harvard administration creates a very steep gradient that rewards deep knowledge of the institution. If you know, the more you can find a pathway through, as if you just kind of stand and shout and say, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that. And so kind of participating in calls like this and being in regular communication will help us find the moments when we can speak up, the causes that will matter, and you can't kind of catch up quickly at the end. It's like a class. You can't do all the reading just before the final. You have to kind of do it along the way. And that really specifically, 1636 has an amazing newsletter, which is read around Harvard and far and wide beyond. Hillel also, we send out weekly communications, so you know what's happening in the university and in the Jewish community, which is not just things administratively, but also the wonderful things that Jewish students are creating, trips to Poland and Hungary and to Israel and founding a cappella groups and almost Tel Aviv style nightclubs that pop up in Cambridge due to their creativity and effort. And so I think you will be a better citizen of the university and a more effective one, the more informed you are. Allison, one last thought.
I think with your permission, since this is a largely Jewish group and we're in the middle of the Omer, we should close with at least something rabbinic, which is the Omer is the time in between leaving Egypt and going to Sinai. So that means that you're in the wilderness, but we are hopefully headed towards something. And I trust that the people who are on this call will continue to make their dissatisfaction known and their hope that, in fact, going towards Sinai, which is something that began Western civilization, will not be something that is ignored in one of the putative bastions of Western civilization.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you for that. That really rounded out the call, I think. Allison, you had one more example you wanted to offer also, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah,
And
I want to say one more example that doesn't take any money or anything like that, not even going to an event. I think it's really valuable for people on this call to reconnect with professors that they had when they were at Harvard who are still here. Talk to the professors about what's actually going on campus. And if you think they're thoughtful about it, ask them to go and serve on some of the key committees that make a lot of the important decisions. So much of what has happened at Harvard is that the people who go and serve on those committees are not necessarily ones who are as aware of, concerned about, or even aligned on some of the issues that have been discussed on this call. And that's because serving on those committees is a thankless task. Like, I'm sure some people have their qualms with certain members of certain task forces, but I want to make it clear that it's a pretty selfless task that people put thousands of hours into writing this report that Jared led. And even if you disagree with things that they wrote, where they are coming from and things like that, that's a real public service that they did. And so at a minimum, even if you don't go and reconnect with the professor to ask them to serve on the committee, giving thanks to the people who are doing tons of volunteer work. They are not getting paid for this. And giving them a bit more of a boost of energy so they can keep on going and fighting the good fight is a really important thing to do.
And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And just as a really quick note of what's going on, just to give a picture, Rabbi Wolpe was faculty at a conference I was at in 2008. We had a lunchtime conversation that I cite all the time and think about. Professor Schisser was a mentor of mine back at Yale. We don't say here, years ago, giving incredibly valuable advice. Jared and I, we sent our kids to school together and exchange texts about days off and things as we work together. I think the thing that one of the ways of thinking about the work that the Jewish people were undertaking out of Egypt was to go from being slaves to a community who have the capacity to support one another. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, is what it means that hundreds and hundreds of you are here tonight. And it's something that is an incredible honor to be able to convey to our students, that there are thousands of people out in the world who care about them, even though they've never met them, and will do everything they can to support them. So I want to thank you all for being here. We will consistently be in touch. There was a request for sending out the links to the reports. We will send out a recording of this call and other information. The next big deadline, just to keep in mind, is each dean of the schools at Harvard, which are about a dozen, is supposed to have an action report by the end of the semester, which is approaching quickly. It's not yet clear whether those reports will be made public. So a great ask to make when you talk to them is that I would love to see the action plan plan for my school. The more of those, it's easier for them to ignore me and Allison. It's hard for them to ignore 750 of all of us together. And we will keep being steadfast champions for these causes and our community, and cannot wait to continue to do that work together. Thank you all for being here. Good night.